All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out this afternoon. We're so happy you're here. My name's Joel Arnold. I am the policy director here at Abundant Housing Michigan. And I will say, as a practicing urban planner, it warms my heart to see a full room on a sunny Friday afternoon to talk about land use regulation. So you guys are truly the coolest folks in the area. So we're very happy to have you here. A little bit about us at Abundant Housing Michigan. We are a statewide advocacy organization really focused on one simple thing, right? And that's fighting to legalize housing in our state. And that's what the conversation today is going to be about. So we're very excited for our guest here today, and I'll introduce him in a moment. But I'd be remiss if we didn't first give thanks to the folks here at Park and our local affiliate, YIMBY Plymouth. So we give them a round of applause. We greatly appreciate it. They've been doing excellent work in the community here, really throughout the year. Relatively new organization, but great Plymouth residents who really care about this issue and help make today's event happen. I also want to give thanks to our staff here at Abundant Housing Michigan, our executive director Lauren Strickland, our lead organizer Kiana Alexander, and our board president Adam Goodman, all sitting in the back row here. If you guys can give them a round of applause, they help pay the bills. So. And so a few things, as Nolan is speaking, the way we're going to do this today is Nolan will give a brief book talk. We'll then hand it over for some remarks from State Representative Jason Morgan, and then we'll do a panel discussion up here at the front. When we get to the panel discussion, Jamie with YIMBY Plymouth, who is also going to be moderating that discussion, has note cards that she'll be passing around. If you have questions that you want to ask that come to mind, write it down on that note card, and one of us, myself or Kiana or Lauren, will come around and pick that up, and we'll give them to Jamie. We will get through as many questions as we possibly can, but make sure if you got a burning question, you want to get it asked, we want to make sure we get those into today's event. So all that to say, I'm going to be happy now to introduce a good friend of mine and the author of Arbitrary Lines, How Zoning Broke the American City and How to Fix It. Nolan Gray is a professional city planner and writer. He currently leads the Metropolitan Abundance Project, where he's focused on reinvigorating American cities through an urban abundance agenda. He formerly served as the senior director of policy at California YIMBY, and like myself, also served as a city planner in local planning departments, and has been through all the processes that we're going to talk about here today. So without further ado, Nolan, if you want to use that mic, we'll introduce Nolan Gray.
Great. Is this on? Check, check, 1, 2. I can also talk loud. I love this space setup. I feel like I'm going to get a cadaver and put it on the body or put it on the table here more. But it's great to be here. Thanks so much to Plymouth YIMBY for organizing this in Abundant Housing Michigan. I'm here from the future, from California, from a parallel world where if Michigan does not take action, it will start to look a lot more like that. But we're talking about solutions today, but let's start with sort of setting the table. So this is a chart of the home price index for housing in Michigan. I'm old enough to remember when this was a historic run-up in prices that changed everything and destroyed the American economy. Should I use this instead?
Yes.
Okay, check, good. So for those listening for a recording, I made a bunch of really funny jokes. Everybody laughed. So I'm old enough to remember when this was a historic run-up in prices that changed everything. Of course, we are now right here. Housing prices have dramatically increased over the last 5 to 6 years. This is the number one factor driving the rise in the cost of living, and repeatedly we find that this is the number one issue facing American families in Michigan and across the country. It's the cost of living. The largest line item in a family's budget is housing, and so if we don't get this under control, a lot of families are going to be in a tough situation. This cost increase is not a happy story. There's no nice way to slice it. Sometimes, of course, costs increase because incomes are going up. That's not what's happening with housing. Housing is getting increasingly more expensive relative to incomes, meaning that more and more families are no longer having a path to homeownership. Is everybody depressed now? Good? We'll pull you back out. So the kind of sort of good news is that this crisis is a policy choice. Very typically, Michigan, like the rest of the country, I'm from Kentucky, I've worked in California, they all have broadly the same profile on this. The big driver here is we've simply not been building nearly enough housing. Housing is complex, it's multifaceted. Building a lot more housing does not solve everything, but if you're not building a lot more housing when in a surging demand environment, remember what this chart looked like, right? Prices dramatically increasing, no change in permitting, you put yourself on a path toward a permanent housing crisis. To the extent that Metro Detroit, like again, very typical of many US cities to the extent we still build, it's almost exclusively greenfield, meaning that families have to move further and further out into housing that is replacing natural and working lands. And oddly enough, we've made it altogether illegal to build the types of traditional charming urbanism, neighborhoods with a mixture of housing types, walkable main streets. I don't think I need to explain any of this to anybody who lives in Plymouth. You have an outstanding example of it. But ironically, we've made it illegal to build the most desirable forms of housing. So what can we do? I think there's a lot of factors that drive housing underproduction, but most of them are not under the control of state and local legislators or policymakers or planners. You don't control interest rates, you don't control tariffs, you don't control immigration policy, et cetera, but there are three really, really important things that state and local bodies do control. The first is the zoning. Is it simply illegal to build the most affordable forms of housing? Is it legal to build things like townhouses, duplexes, small multifamily buildings? In the vast majority of American residential neighborhoods, yes, it's simply illegal. So that's the end of the conversation. You cannot build the most affordable forms of housing. But let's say the zoning does allow that. Is it easy to get an entitlement or a permit? Does it take months or years to just get permitted to start building something that you're theoretically allowed to build? Do you have to undertake multiple public hearings? Do you have to undertake tens of thousands of dollars in studies? Again, it's all too often the case that we subject housing development to extremely difficult permitting hurdles, and then we're surprised when none of it gets built, and the only housing that does get built is incredibly expensive. And then finally, let's say you've got the zoning to build housing, you can get your entitlements and permits, but if there are a whole bunch of other unfunded mandates that get tacked on top of that, and the housing's financially infeasible to build, then again, none of that other stuff matters. And so I think it's important that we think about this thing. The way we think about it in the work that we've done out west is it's a pipe, and you've got to open 3 valves. You pass one valve, reforming your zoning, that's great, but you've got to fix the other 2. Let's get a read of the room here. Who here is a zoning expert? Surely at least one, right? I hope you're a zoning expert. Okay. Who here knows a little bit about zoning? You played SimCity, right? Okay, who are the happy, normal, well-adjusted people who don't know anything about zoning? It's not too late to leave. Okay. I want to reinforce that I think reforming a lot of these policies, revisiting a lot of these policies is necessary, if not sufficient, to solving this crisis. And I think it's important to think about a lot of these things because this is the secret code that shapes our cities. Another important aspect of this is that these rules and these processes have become enormously more complex over the last 50 or 60 years, depending on where you are in the country. This is a snippet from the zoning map of Queens, New York. I was a city planner in Queens. This is the same neighborhood as it was zoned in 1961 when the zoning code was overhauled, and then when I was a planner there in 2022. And what you can see is dramatic increase in complexity of the code, right? And so I think that just over time, every institution, every policy needs to be revisited, but especially in the case of zoning, right? We are at the centennial of the Euclid v. Ambler decision, and I think this is a good time as any to have a big picture conversation about, are our codes working for us? And I think as we've already kind of hopefully established on the margin of housing affordability, they're not. The really good news is that this is a crisis that we know how to end, and cities and states in a variety of different contexts are making progress on it. There are 3 paths to reform. So a unique feature of American land use planning is that it's historically almost entirely local. So cities are delegated this power by the state, cities, townships, villages, hamlets, counties. They're delegating these powers, and historically they've had pretty wide authority in how to administer them. And so local governments can and should be making progress on this. Reforming, I'll talk about a bunch of the solutions, but reforming your zoning, liberalizing your zoning, speeding up your permitting processes, revisiting some of your unfunded mandates. But what I'm going to talk about a lot in this talk is the potential role of the state. Everything that I'll talk about that the state could do, local governments could do. But for reasons I'll talk about on the next slide, I think the state has an important role to play in a lot of this work. And then I think there's value in a fundamental rethink, but I've been given 20 minutes, so we can talk about that in the Q&A maybe. So why have more state involvement? I think that's like one of the first questions people ask, especially we have a lot of local government people. The easy answer is, oh, well, if everybody was like you, I would say unlimited local control would be great. But the reason to have state governments play a role, I think one is you have to establish guardrails. There are certain bad actors, cities. There are powers that are commonly abused, right? In nearly every area of delegated powers to local governments, we have established clear guardrails, right? You cannot jerk an applicant down. You cannot arbitrarily reject an applicant who's trying to follow the rules. You cannot take 2 years on a review process. I think these are like common sense, good government things that make sense in all jurisdictions. The second is scaling best practices. In many cases, a lot of the reforms that I'm going to talk about today were policies that were first adopted by local governments that made a lot of sense and have been scaled statewide in a variety of different states. And I think that makes a lot of sense. The third is giving local elected officials and planners cover to, in many cases, do the things that they already want to do. So with surprising frequency, if anybody who's been in local government or been a planner knows, it's incredibly hard to stand in front of a room full of people at the Tuesday 10 a.m. meeting when somebody proposes to build 10 townhouses and 100 people have showed up and they're all screaming at you, right? It's really, really hard to reform in that context. And I think the state can play a valuable role in saying, hey, the state tied our hands, we had to approve that project. With surprising frequency, we have mayors or council members or planners who were on the record as having deep concerns about state reforms, say, actually, yeah, I kind of appreciate you tying my hands here. Did anybody see The Odyssey recently? What do you do when you're going to sail past the sirens? You tie yourself to the mast so you can't misbehave. If you saw it in the 70 millimeter one, then you really know what I'm talking about. And then finally is making sure that every jurisdiction is doing its fair share. Another unique feature of American planning is that the typical metropolitan area is divided up across dozens, sometimes even hundreds of different jurisdictions, dozens of different counties. And if some of those jurisdictions are reforming but others are not, it's going to be very hard to make progress on these issues, right? Again, I think you guys are all pretty familiar with this. I used to live and work in Los Angeles where we had 88 different cities. If even 25% of those cities did the right thing and adopted all of the pro-housing reforms I'll talk about today, it still would not potentially end the housing crisis, right? Because we all have to be doing our fair share. So what's happening at the state level? So here's a map of where there's been pro-housing legislation over the last, I believe, 5 or 6 years, I think since 2020. So you can see we've been very, very busy in California. Our friends in states like Maine and Texas and Virginia have also been very active. But as things stand, there's been very little activity here in Michigan. And it's not totally surprising. I think that in many parts of Michigan, of course, historically, the problem was maybe a slight surplus of housing, right? But as we all know, and this is true certainly in the area we're in right now, right? Housing affordability really has become a top issue. And I think that now is the time for Michigan to start playing a proactive role. One of the beautiful things about this, given the polarization that affects almost every other area of American life, is that this is not a conservative or Republican issue. We've done work in Utah, Washington. In Utah, they talk about families and homeownership. In Washington, they talk about the environment. In Montana, they talk about property rights and free markets. And in Connecticut, they talk about equity and rectifying historic injustices. So what are we talking about here? I'll talk about a few common sense reforms, and in each case, I identify a good piece of model legislation, and again, this could be the reasonable basis for a local ordinance. I think one of the first and most important things we've got to do is we've got to legalize starter homes again. What is a starter home in 2026? It's a townhouse, it's a small lot home, it's a 2 or 3 bedroom condo. That's what's affordable in a context where once land prices hit a certain threshold, you've got to build smarter. A number of cities have made progress allowing for more efficient use of land. This better leverages existing infrastructure, and it again creates housing that's more affordable to working families. And I don't know, we need a term for the opposite of a starter home, but many folks there's one of the largest growing demographics in the US is retired empty nesters, right? Maybe an ending home. I don't know, it sounds kind of depressing. But a lot of people want to downsize into housing like this, and they want to open up maybe the existing family-sized home that they live in, but these smaller typologies are just not available. I think another no-brainer reform is allowing residential and commercial areas. One of the strange things that we did over the last century was we said that residential and commercial were going to be strictly separate. And there was some reason to some aspects of that, right, of keeping heavy industry out of residential neighborhoods. I don't think anybody's proposing to change that. But the traditional Main Street, the mixture of housing that we all know and love has become illegal, and I think fixing that is something that a lot of states have made progress on. Does this look familiar? Certainly looks familiar coming from California and actually Kentucky and every place I've ever lived. We built thousands and thousands of communities like this, and in many cases, in an era of e-commerce and remote work, these places are struggling, there are liabilities, nothing's happening here. We often talk about housing like it's a nuisance, like it's something we have to bear and deal with. We have to allocate it, but if done right, building more housing can actually be an amenity. It can enrich the quality of life of people who live here. For the people who live just out of this frame, they now have a walkable town center. Maybe if they want to downsize in their community, they have a new place they can live. If they want their young adult children to come back, they now have places where they can live. There are now places where the home health care worker, or the police officer, or the person working at the supermarket can afford to live. I would say that's a pretty good thing. I think another thing that's spread really rapidly, is we can talk more about this maybe in Q&A, is restoring missing middle. Many great historic American neighborhoods, it was not all single-family homes. It wasn't also all apartments. It's a mixture of housing types. A mixture of different housing types serving people at different stages of life, at different levels of income, right? Every city has great neighborhoods just like this. In many cases, we slap preservation ordinances on them because we like them so much. But then we say, well, we never ever want another duplex or another cottage court or another row of townhouses to be built. A lot of cities and states have made a lot of progress legalizing what's called missing middle. It's that middle between single-family homes and mid-rise or higher multifamily housing. It doesn't necessarily disrupt the character of neighborhoods, adds additional housing, opens up neighborhoods to more people without necessarily always triggering a huge backlash. And then finally, I think another no-brainer zoning policy is legalizing accessory dwelling units. I'm not going to tell too many happy stories about California because we still have a lot of work to do on this, but one of the most successful things we've done has been guaranteeing the right of property owners across the state to add an additional unit to their property. ADUs is the planning jargon term, mother-in-law units, granny flats, we call them casitas, allowing folks to add an additional housing unit in a new detached structure or attached structure, converting a garage, a basement, an attic. We undertook this reform in 2017. Before 2017, ADUs were basically illegal everywhere. There were dozens of them built every year. Beginning in 2017, we started building out a statewide framework. And because we had a statewide framework, there was a standard set of rules. So you could start getting a market of small builders who could build the same type of ADU anywhere in the state. We started getting manufactured or modular ADUs that could be shipped to the site. I think that if any audience can appreciate the value of assembly line manufacturing, it'd be a Michigan audience, right? But we started to be able to build housing incredibly efficiently and put it in a distributed way, and in a way that allows for things like intergenerational households, right? Allows for, so commonly, people will build one of these and to keep a young adult child close or a young couple close, to create a new source of income, to age in place. There's a variety of different options. This reform, which costs the state nothing, has facilitated over 100,000 new housing units built over the last 10 years. It's pretty remarkable. If zoning's not sexy, streamlining, permitting, and entitlement is really not sexy, but it's really, really important. I think a few things that have been done here is allowing for licensed third-party architects and engineers to do this work, especially when there's a backlog. This is how it works in most of the rest of the developed world. Not to suggest that we're not the best at everything, but it works well in other contexts, allowing for a licensed third-party architect or engineer not otherwise involved in the project to do a lot of that review. That can really clear out a logjam. The second thing, and I think most people are surprised when I tell them that this is not already law, is reviewing projects pursuant to objective standards. So having clear and objective standards that allow applicants to apply to build housing with confidence that they're not going to be surprised by a mandate or an interpretation that derails their projects. One thing I'll just say globally about streamlining, all of this is especially important if you want to bring back your small-scale local builders, right? If you have an environment where it takes months or years to get a project entitled and permitted, and it involves a lot of negotiations, and it involves hiring an attorney and hiring a team of land use planners, no skin off my back, you're not going to get small-scale builders. You're going to have no local builders, and then you're going to have big national builders that come in and build big products. If you want to have an ecosystem of small-scale local builders building these small-scale projects, you have to work through a lot of these things. Another thing that we've seen since COVID is permitting timelines have slowed. There was a really interesting study that Rand did of Texas, California, Colorado, with Texas being the most pro-growth, California being the most anti-growth, Colorado being somewhere in the middle. A surprising finding is that one of the big cost drivers in California was not necessarily any specific mandate, but simply the fact that California took so much longer to conduct these reviews, right? And there was so much more unpredictability. That alone was a major cost driver. Now, I've heard you go to planning hearings and people say, well, I think this project should have more parking. I think this project should have fewer units. I think this project should da-da-da-da. I've never at a planning hearing heard somebody say, I wish the permit review process would just take longer, right? I think this is one thing that's a no-brainer, low-hanging reform. Another thing that a lot of cities and states are doing is pre-approved plans. So going out, talking to neighbors, figuring out what are the typologies that we're all comfortable with? What are maybe the housing types that already exist in our community? Cottage courts are very popular in many parts of California, but in many cases they were illegal to build. And so what many cities have done is said, okay, if you're going to build a certain typology that we all know and love and we like, we will get you through the process incredibly quickly. That creates a beautiful type of housing that people already like, and it encourages developers to pursue that program, and it doesn't necessarily raise the stink of some of these other reforms. Lastly is costs. thinking through, okay, are we actually imposing so many costs on projects that they become infeasible? This is probably the wonkiest set, but we'll give you a few examples here. Is anybody particularly offended by this project? Many jurisdictions ban vinyl siding or they just require masonry. That can add $10,000, $20,000 to the cost of a unit. Is anybody particularly offended by this house? This is actually manufactured. Many jurisdictions ban manufactured housing as a matter of course. I think these rules were adopted back when manufactured housing meant inexpensive trailers that really were housing that had specific types of problems. Modern manufactured or modular housing is incredibly high quality, it's incredibly cheap, and yet again, many cities continue to prohibit them outright. A number of states have taken, I think, important steps to address that. Last and closest to my heart, having done a lot of parking policy, is the variety of mandates that go above and beyond actual health and safety considerations and that drive up costs. Many jurisdictions require tons and tons of off-street parking. Of course, this I think reduces the walkability of the community. It creates an expectation where people drive. It results in more traffic. In a context like Plymouth and the greater Detroit area, it makes it actually twice as hard to do the thing that we would probably most want developers to do, which is to historically rehabilitate historic properties, right? So in many cases, if there's a parking requirement for some of these developments that existed before zoning, you'll have to get some sort of variance or have to go through some sort of discretionary relief process to actually do the thing that we desperately want our small-scale local developers to do. And it's in the title of my book, but in many cases, these rules are just arbitrary and somewhat absurd. So this is from a zoning ordinance in Texas. If you operate a tavern or a pub, you have to provide 10 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet. If you operate a small bar, you have to provide 12. And if you operate a bar, club, or lounge, you have to provide 14. If you know the difference between these three uses, you might make a great land use planner. In any case, all of these uses exist to get people in a state where they should not be driving. And yet we require off-street parking. If anything that I've discussed today has been interesting, we've got a list of model legislation. We're working on model local ordinances. This is the starting point, which your local experts can then use to build something great. But I've been told to always leave with a call to action. If you're an elected official or commissioner, be the policy leader that your community needs. Housing affordability, cost of living is the number one issue. It's consistently coming up as the number one issue. I talk to a lot of elected officials, they say this is the number one thing that people raise, right? We need leadership on this. If you're a planner or developer, be the policy entrepreneur that your community needs, right? In many cases, your local elected officials or your local commissioners might be interested in undertaking reform, but they don't know where to start. They need policy entrepreneurs. Like I said, most people live happy, normal lives where they don't think about zoning all day. And then the activists, which I think hopefully would include everybody, is keep working on this. You know, I've been working on this issue for, I guess now 12 or 13 years. A whole bunch of policy reforms that I was told were completely impossible when we first started doing this work now take on a feeling of inevitability. I remember when I took planning law, when I got my planning degree, the professor joked, 2 things will survive the apocalypse: cockroaches and single-family zoning. The idea was you can never, ever add housing to existing built-out neighborhoods. And now, of course, dozens of different states have adopted policies allowing for ADUs, allowing for missing middle, et cetera. So I think we have committed activists with good ideas and good research, willing to talk to other people and listen to their concerns and find a solution, have a way of turning the impossible into the inevitable. It's been a privilege to speak to you today, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Nolan. We appreciate you being here. And before I introduce our next speaker, just to make a few remarks, I want to make sure I acknowledge the presence of our Congresswoman here in the district, Congresswoman Debbie Dingell. Thank you so much. We appreciate you making time out of what I have no doubt is an incredibly busy schedule to listen to us talk about setback requirements and things like that. Yes, right. So next up, I'm going to bring up just to say a few words, State Representative Jason Morgan. State Representative Morgan serves Michigan's 23rd District, which includes portions of Ann Arbor, Salem, Superior Township, Northville Township, and Plymouth Township. Previously, he served as a Washtenaw County Commissioner and gained experience on the Washtenaw County Urban County Executive Committee and Brownfield Development Authority. Representative Morgan is highly focused on tackling economic and social inequality, and his work includes championing affordable housing, supporting public infrastructure, and promoting sustainable community development. Representative Morgan.
Thanks, Joel. And I just have very brief comments because I think the important piece here really has been that presentation around what it means to be able to address the affordability crisis in housing. But also just want to give appreciation to Rep. Kolazar, whose district we're in now. Matt is always so amazing in having us over in his district, and all the local electeds who are here too. This is a tough challenge that we face at every level of government, but particularly at the local level, where you have a lot of very strong feelings and emotions because the decisions around housing are not just about four walls and a ceiling and a floor here. We're really talking about our communities, our neighborhoods, the very fabric of why we live in these great places. So the one really important thing I just want to share is that at the heart of this isn't just about policy or zoning, it's about our values. It's about really a generational challenge of the American dream. It's about the challenge of, can we afford to live in our communities? Can we afford to buy a home and stay in the community that we grew up in or go back to after college? It's, can we stay and age in place as we get older? And can we build a family in a place that is vibrant and accessible for everyone? That is what we're talking about. It's about the zoning, it's about the details. Those are the things that really, really matter. But at the heart of this is about making sure the American dream is accessible for everyone once again. We've talked about the affordability crisis so much in our state and nationally right now. It is the issue, is the defining issue of our generation. At the heart of that is the fact that folks cannot afford to buy a home or to pay rent. And it ties to every other thing we do. We've got to address affordability with our utilities, groceries, every other aspect of living today. But those things pale in comparison to the increased cost of housing today compared to even 10 years ago or maybe 20 years ago. So that is why this issue is so important to me personally. As a younger elected official, I want to make sure that my generation and the generations behind me have the same opportunities, and actually much more than my generation is facing today, and make sure that we can solve this crisis. It's on us. The details matter, these conversations matter, but at the end of the day, we've got to understand the broad nature of the challenge we're facing and know that we can do something about it. So that's what I'm excited to be here talking about today, and so glad you are all here on your lunchtime on a Friday afternoon, and thank you so much. Great to be with you guys.
All right, well, I'll say, Representative Morgan, if you want to grab a chair wherever fits best, and I'll introduce the rest of our panel here today. In addition to Representative Morgan, and pardon us while we move some things around here, our other panelist here today is Dawn Crandall. Dawn has been with the Home Builders Association of Michigan since 1996 and was recently promoted to the Executive Vice President of Government Relations. She's directly responsible for lobbying on behalf of the members on issues that impact education, taxation, workforce development, and economic development. And Dawn is also the Executive Director of the Home Builders Association of Michigan's nonprofit, Skilled to Build Michigan Foundation, where she's focused on cultivating, educating, and recruiting the workforce of tomorrow today. Ladies and gentlemen, Dawn Crandall. And then last but not least, I will introduce our moderator and hand the mic off to her. Jamie Cavanaugh is a proud Plymouth resident and co-founder of YIMBY Plymouth. She also serves as Senior State Policy Counsel at the Pacific Legal Foundation, where she works with legislators around the country to end burdensome laws and create opportunities for individuals to thrive. Interesting to me, Jamie studied linguistics and German at the University of Michigan. Before earning her JD from the University of Colorado, she completed a judicial fellowship with Justice Monica Marquez before spending 5 years at the Mountain States Legal Foundation and 5 years at the Institute for Justice. So, ladies and gentlemen, Plymouth native Jamie Cavanaugh.
Joel. So if everyone wants to write down your questions, there's pens around, please pass them around to each other. Joel and Ari from Abundant Housing Michigan will come around and pick up the questions. But I'm going to kick it off with a few that we have prepared first. So Nolan, I'll start with you. We want to ask you about what are some of the changes that you've seen in other states that are having a meaningful impact. You talked about ADUs in California, and maybe some of the reforms that are happening around the country. It might be a little too early to tell, but if you want to mention a few more or some results that you've seen from changes.
Yeah, I think in terms of getting units built, probably the most successful reforms have been, I talked about legalizing accessory dwelling units in California. That's been huge. And, something on the order of 1 in 4 homes built in California last year was an ADU. That's a housing unit that would have been illegal to build 10 years ago without state level reforms. That's been a really, really important one. I think another one that's been quite successful has been Florida's Live Local Act. In the middle of the pandemic, they're dealing with the same problem that a lot of states were dealing with, significant shortage of workforce housing at the same time that they have a lot of strip malls and office parks that are in a pretty rough state. And so they legalized residential development in commercial areas with I think, a workable workforce housing requirement. So there had to be housing units reserved for 120% of the area median income. And that's been enormously successful. It's not been without controversy, which is true of any law that's actually getting housing built. Those two, I think, have been pretty impressive. One, I would say, too, I guess, to round it out, Texas has made a lot of progress legalizing starter homes, reducing minimum lot sizes, allowing for new subdivisions to just use land more efficiently, put more homes and more affordable homes on the land, and then allow for infill subdivisions as well. I said this, I think, earlier on in my talk, but the starter home of 2026 is a townhouse. It's a small lot home. And so if we're not building those, we're not creating the next generation of homeowners, and Texas has done a lot. I would love to have more Midwestern examples, but this is an amazing opportunity for Michigan to lead, so I can go share those in other states nearby.
Great, thank you. We have a question about defining affordable. Are we talking about rent below a certain number or a home price at a certain number? And no, we're talking about building more housing units, which creates more affordability, which, it's a simple question of supply and demand. Even when you put luxury units onto the market, you see the units in the lower cost range open up. In the future, those luxury units also go down in price. We're not talking today about income restricted units. That's something that YIMBY Action, the parent organization of YIMBY Plymouth, supports, but that's just not part of the conversation that we're having today. We would love to see more of that, but that's not what we're talking about when we say affordable housing. We want there to be market rate housing that is affordable for people at all income levels. Maybe for Dawn, I'll do this one, and anyone else if they want to chime in too. In Plymouth, we're seeing a lot of tearing down of affordable starter homes. Either how do we stop this, or what can we do to have more starter homes in the community?
That's a tough question. I think a lot of it is you're seeing where in areas like Plymouth, where maybe you do have the smaller lot sizes because you are a pretty built out community, but driving in, even coming in from the Lansing area, I drove through larger homes and then closer homes and then some apartments and townhomes. Like, it was a really nice mix as I drove here today. We're seeing that around the state where people are buying kind of those smaller lot sizes because that's what's available, and then they're tearing down the smaller home and then they're building up. We're seeing that not only in Michigan, but we're seeing that across the country. But we are at a point now where you have those younger generations that want the smaller home with, less upkeep, and how do you find that? And, you talked about, not talking about affordable housing, and we've actually kind of abolished that phrase from our mission statement even, and we've turned it into attainable housing, so at all levels. But every time you increase the cost of a house by $1,000 today, you price out over 5,000 individuals into the market. And so think about that. And if you go back to the statement of the people who are probably tearing down and building up are the ones who actually can afford to do that. And so a lot of that is market driven. And, it's people choosing to live where they want to live. And if they want to live in a community that's well established and cute and walkable and has all the amenities, and their only option is to buy on a smaller lot size but build up, that's what you're going to see. I don't know that you can, I guess you can zone it and make it illegal, but there aren't a lot of options out there.
Well, and when I was in Queens, this was before when I was a planner, but over the course of the early 2000s, Queens had been in a situation where many neighborhoods, there was a surge in demand, there was the teardowns happening, and they adopted a whole bunch of ordinances to prohibit teardowns or to prohibit you from rebuilding a larger home. This just resulted in the same existing housing stock becoming more expensive. It didn't address the housing affordability crisis. In neighborhoods where they did not do this, where they maintained missing middle zoning, the older homes that would have not changed in a physical sense but gotten to be more expensive instead, in many cases, were subdivided, or they were able to take the lot and put 2 or 3 townhouses on the lot that were affordable starter homes or affordable rentals, as the case may be. To pick up on something that Jamie said, I mean, I think the distinction between, what do we mean by affordable housing? The way I put it is this, because in California, YIMBY, we've supported bond measures for affordable housing. We support we absolutely need more public support for deed-restricted affordable housing, and we've supported every single effort to that end, as I think do most YIMBY groups. But if to support more spending on deed-restricted affordable without increasing the overall supply of housing is the California model, right? We increasingly have a small number of deed-restricted affordable units, a very tiny number that get produced each year, but we're not addressing the overall housing crisis because we're not combining those necessary subsidies and supports with an overall increase in the supply of housing. And so these things have to travel together.
Thank you. So Rep. Morgan, here's one for you. We have some comments about everyone likes local control until they disagree with it, right? But here in Plymouth and probably in other communities that you represent as well, we've even done polling and found that voters believe Plymouth was at the right level of multifamily. So are the state bills an example of how one size fits all is a little unfair to the local communities?
I think it's a combination of things. I think the challenge that we see is we just don't have enough supply in our communities. And there's a careful balance of that. You want to preserve the historic nature of communities. You want to preserve as much local control as you can. But we have found very specific requirements in zoning that are the key drivers of the affordability crisis in terms of not being able to build enough. This package, I've had so many conversations with local leaders about it, and the challenge I've understood is I still believe in zoning. I still believe we want to preserve the best parts of our communities, but it's a careful balance of making sure that you're not over-zoning or setting requirements that are so stringent, as you saw from the presentation, that you cannot build the things that people like the most about so many communities that have been the historic nature of it. So allowing more of that flexibility, I think, is really important. Allowing a little more density is important. Allowing new housing types that you might not have thought of as things you'd want in your community before, but that you see in some of the images from the presentation that have modernized and can be more affordable. And I think the question of affordability of, yes, there's affordable housing, there's housing that can be affordable. And I think that's the distinction, sort of the attainable housing idea. But what we're going to see nationally, thanks to Congresswoman Dingell and our federal legislators, the 21st Century Road to Housing Act that was bipartisan that passed has the potential to transform our country and really address this challenge through more of an incentive model where every community is going to be able to apply for funds to take a hard look at our zoning and understand where are the improvements that can be made or the updates that can be made, and have the financial support to back that, to allow that to be possible. It's also going to have incentives for our state to be able to transform how we look at building more housing and doing it in the right way. The one key piece I want to mention is that I would never just build whatever you want anywhere, truly. Communities do need to have a say in how the housing is done, how it looks, and how we want our communities to feel and interact with each other when it comes to housing and infrastructure, transportation, every other aspect of it. But there's some balance between what we have today and what we need to see to ensure that we can build more housing affordability across the board.
Thank you. I'm going to stick with you for a second. We have another question about what is the difference between cities, villages, townships, and more rural and undeveloped land? How do the bills address the difference in those areas, and what can we do to encourage development where in cities or in areas that already have infrastructure?
Yeah, absolutely. That is a really important piece. Where we really want to build more housing is in urbanized areas and transit corridors, and we want density in the places that make sense, and we don't want just a bunch of sprawl. That does not help. The cost of the infrastructure alone is exponentially higher when you have sprawl versus building dense downtowns and urban cores and transit corridors where you can have people live and get to work and school without having to drive a car. Those types of things are really important. There is difference between the urban areas we want to incentivize more. This package does have different requirements based on metropolitan statistical areas and population and some of those nuances in those bills. I can't speak to Dawn could speak better to these very narrow specifics of which exactly numbers here and there, but there's an attempt in there to address that consideration so that we're not having a truly one-size-fits-all approach to everything. The other piece is that it sets it raises the floor around what the requirements can be, but in no way does it eliminate the local options or requirements at all, preserves the environmental protections, and so many other aspects that are really important for local communities to have oversight over.
Thank you so much. This one's a little wonky, but I think the audience here can handle it. We have a question for Nolan about, can you talk about the impact of California Prop 13 as a disincentive to seniors downsizing? So we have a similar problem. We have a similar law in Michigan that locks you into your property taxes and makes you afraid to ever move because even if you get a smaller house, you'll pay 3 times as much in property taxes. And do you have any ideas about how to solve that problem?
Guys, I came to Michigan, so I didn't have to talk about Prop 13 for 48 hours. But yeah, so for those who don't know, in the 1970s, there was a tax revolt in California. We adopted Prop 13, essentially locking in property tax bills unless you redevelop or sell. And so this, of course, has a number of weird flukes. The longer you're in your home, the lower your property tax bill is in real terms. And then you can also pass that along to your heirs, and it's very complex. I'll give the devil its due. That was a period of rapid inflation where home prices were increasing rapidly, property tax bills really were going up rapidly. There was a very sympathetic type of homeowner of, hey, I'm a low-income homeowner, and the home values in my area have increased dramatically, and now I'm paying a far higher property tax bill, especially painful if you're a senior on a fixed income. And so I think there were reasonable concerns, but those were, I think, drafted into the cause of what's been a very destructive tax policy. I think a few things. One is this creates a slight fiscal and disincentive to build more housing. Over time, a city will collect less revenue. It provides a strong incentive for cities to encourage types of development that generate some other form of taxes. So this is why California famously we're the home of strip mall suburbia, right? Because every local city is fighting tooth and nail to generate sales tax revenue. Stop me if this sounds familiar. I've exclusively talked about zoning streamlining and cost mandates, but this is a broader thing that needs to be considered, especially in this moment where a lot of states are considering what I would view as very ham-handed and potentially very destructive property tax freezes. And I think, I actually think a really great example of this to talk about my own hometown, Lexington, Kentucky. They were dealing with this, and they came up with a program where if you're a qualifying low-income senior, you've been a homeowner for a certain period of time, you can keep your property tax bill flat, and then the margin, that difference is paid back when you choose to sell the home. And that struck me as a very fair way to avoid displacement or inappropriate annual increases in tax bills while still ensuring that everybody pays their fair share. But based on conversations happening in places like Florida, I'm worried that we're just not having a nuanced conversation about this. We're putting, especially cities, we're putting them on a trajectory where it's just going to be very hard for them to generate basic operating revenue. In California, this has been so destructive because cities don't have this stable source of predictable income. They end up relying on things like impact fees. Right? So now if you want to build almost any housing in California, I didn't talk about it so much here because I'm not so familiar with the local context, but you're often required to pay 6 figures in impact fees up front because they know they're not going to be getting certain property tax revenue in the long term. So if anybody has any questions about the wisdom of blunt property tax freezes, you're more than welcome to come visit us in California, and we will explain to you some of the drawbacks.
Thank you. So I think this question would be good for all the panelists. We can start with Dawn, maybe. We're talking a lot about zoning reforms, but what other government interventions are necessary to make housing more attainable?
Well, I think when we look at it, and Nolan talked about it a bit in his presentation, is the streamlining in the process. I've heard that should this zoning reform package go through, builders are going to be able to just pop up homes overnight, and that's not the case. There's finding your financing, there's the engineering, there's the architecture, there's the plot and plat development. There still is time built into this before it even goes before a planning commission for approval. So I think as we look at that streamlining process in terms of once a local has all the information, then there's a certain amount of time that they can get back. I've talked to some of my builders, they're 3 years in on a project and don't have approval yet. And I think the thing that individuals forget is during that 3 years, those builders still have carrying costs, right? They're still paying their property taxes, they're still, maintaining the property. They're doing all the things without getting a return on that investment yet. And so I think as we look at that, and it goes back to, we've talked a lot about supply and demand, and I love to throw these figures out just to put it in perspective and how far behind we truly are as a state in building. Our last build was in 2005. So it was what, 21 years ago? 54,000 single-family permits were pulled. In 2007, that number dropped to 15,000. In 2009, that number dropped to 6,900. In 2024, we built 15,045 single-family permits were pulled, and we're only projecting for 2026, 15,376. I'm not talking where we've peaked and valleyed. This is like, I think I can, I think I can, I think I can. And when you look at the average age of a house in our state, we talked about tearing down, right? The average age of a house in our state is like over 50 years old. They're not as energy efficient because they were built 50 years ago when energy efficiency was not necessarily the thing, right? You also look at the age of the builder, so we talk a lot about supply and demand. Labor costs, the average age of a builder in the state of Michigan is 58. For every 4 licensees that are retiring, we have 1 coming into the industry, which means your labor costs are going to be more, which impacts the cost of housing. So I think there's a lot of things we can look at in terms of, are all the reports and studies required that are being asked of a builder or developer as they do a subdivision. And to Nolan's point, as you do more and more, you're really shutting smaller builders out of being able to get into the industry and go back to that every 4 going out, every 1 coming in. That's a small builder. They're not established yet. And so I think there are a lot of things we can look at, but zoning reform is an important piece of that because the end result of what locals do increases the cost of a home.
Same question. What other interventions should government be considering?
Well, I think, something that we've been doing a lot more work on is I think you have to have a bunch of other policies in place to ensure that growth not only can accommodate new housing production, but you're not only accommodating new housing production, you're also improving the quality of life of the people around it, right? I think part of why, I think the most sympathetic form of NIMBYism is new development comes in, some public service near me got worse, the parking got worse, the traffic got worse, the transit didn't improve, et cetera. And I think that something that I'd like to see certainly our movement do a better job of is how do we make sure that public services and public benefits can scale alongside growth? I think in parts of the state that I think have maintained a pro-growth culture, places like Texas and Florida, I think they really have a sort of attitude of, well, we're not going to treat growth like it's this nuisance that we need to try to either block or minimize as much as possible, but okay, how can do we have the plan in place? Do we have the bonding authority for local governments? Do we have the sources of revenue to make sure that they can scale services? To give a different context, in Metro DC, I was talking to a planner in a very wealthy suburb that had a metro station. They had just approved a plan to add something like 2,500 housing units, 2,000 housing units, mixed, a different variety, townhouses, apartments, single-family homes, et cetera, a complete community. And I was talking to her. I was like, "How did you get that approved in a community?" On paper, this is your NIMBY enclave, small jurisdiction, 99% homeowner, very wealthy. She said, "Well, our old library had been condemned, and we needed a new site for a library. This master plan project was going to get us a brand new park and a brand new library." And so this thing that I think many people might have at first blush seen as a nuisance of, there's going to be all these new residents near me, it's going to cause all these quality of life issues. Well, now there's a clear benefit that's associated with it. I don't think that's appropriate for every form of housing development. You don't really need to be nickel and diming small scale duplexes and townhouse projects, but at that scale you really can, I think, generate clear and specific public benefits that enrich people's quality of life. And so that's important. I'll say another thing too is, when we survey people about, not people who necessarily show up at every public hearing, though God bless them, but what makes normal people concerned about new development, the top 2 issues consistently are parking and traffic, right? Parking and traffic. Traffic's complex, so I'll set that one aside, but parking's not that complex, right? You can do on-street parking management. You can establish resident parking permit systems. I think a smart and proactive city can say, hey, we're going to protect maybe the on-street parking that you've expected, and we're not going to allow the new development to necessarily come in and take all of the on-street parking. Those are the sorts of interventions that I think address the valid concerns that normal people have about new growth without necessarily from step one saying, well, the growth is going to inconvenience some people, so we're just not doing it. That's how California responded to that answer for 50 years, and it's been a complete disaster.
I'll add, there are a whole number of things beyond zoning. So, for example, one of the very seemingly simple bills, but actually took many years to get done, was a bill we passed at the end of June, which was addressing single stair access. Most people probably didn't even know until we passed this bill you could not build 4 floors without building 2 stairwells. It seems simple, but we just didn't do it for a long time because there were concerns from kind of firefighters. I'll just be, I guess, direct about it. Very valid concerns, but we have had technology upgrades by now that allow us to build just a little bit taller. It might seem like a silly issue, but that brings either up or down the cost of building that housing, and it increases the options of what you can build within a single entity. That's a really positive thing that we were able to do. We passed the Michigan Housing Opportunity Tax Credit, expanding how you can have tax credit access for building more housing and building more housing that can be affordable. We've passed some renter protections. That is really important as well, making sure that as we build new housing, as we have rentals, we're also protecting renters in that process, I think is really important. And really tackling the broader issue of not just thinking about housing in a silo, but housing, transportation, infrastructure, public transit. I'm one of the biggest advocates for public transit in the state, probably to the point where I drive some folks crazy in Lansing at this point, because it's just such a missed opportunity here in Michigan. We can build more density and allow people to live more affordably and happier and more accessibly and safer in so many more areas if we connect communities through public transit. I want more rail access between Detroit, Ann Arbor, Kalamazoo, Chicago. I want more funding for our public transit, for our buses and our systems to be able to get people where they need to go. But you can't just, even fund transit and say, great, now it's going to get done. No, the details of how that gets done matter. And you have to really think about the broader picture of where are we building housing, where are we locating jobs and schools and educational opportunities, and are we making those decisions in a way that considers how it all works together? So for me, I'm the perfect example of I moved to Southeast Michigan 16 years ago from very rural northern Michigan. We didn't have a bus where I grew up. And moved to a place where I said, I want to live in a community where I can walk or get to where I need to go without a car. Fortunately, I have to drive a car more often than not because I am an elected official now, and we drive a lot of places that are all not as timely accessible via bus. But young people want to live in these types of communities. They want to live in these great places that have accessible options for them. And so that's what we have to be thinking about along with all of what we're talking about here.
Absolutely. I think this could be for any of you or maybe all of you. You've all been on the front lines of working for these reforms, and we get a lot of questions about, will these reforms hurt property values, right? Incumbent property owners in single-family neighborhoods are worried that denser housing is going to hurt their investments. Do any of you have a response to that?
Yeah, sure. Well, so this is a pretty robust research literature on this, and it's complicated, as with most things. In general, there's not super clear evidence that necessarily new construction lowers the price of a nearby single-family home. There's a bunch of different ways that people have tried to turn the knobs. It depends on if it's deed restricted affordable, how affordable, right? This can vary. In some cases, though, I think a lot of the proposals that we've talked about today increase the options for what you can do with your property. So if you're a single-family homeowner with a fee simple lot, the ability to add townhouses to that increases the value of the lot, and so that's actual benefit. And not every homeowner, of course, wants to necessarily realize that. In some cases, they might parcel off a portion of their property, or they might sell it to somebody who will replace the existing structure with more housing units. But so, there's a benefit. But I think how does building more housing achieve affordability then? I think two things. One is just more supply and the composition, right? More housing units overall, especially among apartments, more townhouses that are able to use increasingly expensive land more efficiently, right? If you've got a lot and that parcel is going to sell for $100,000, you put one single-family home on that lot, it's going to necessarily be a lot more expensive. If you can put 3, you divide that cost among 3 households and you produce a more affordable product. So no, I don't think there's been any evidence, certainly in California, that this has come to the detriment of single-family homeowners, and to the extent that it's providing them options to downsize and sell without having to leave the state, or to keep their young adult children close by, or to keep the people that serve them in their community close by, I think it's been a benefit. Something that's happening in California too is because we've just so not addressed this problem for so long. I feel like I'm like a recovering addict telling my story here. Because we've just so not addressed this problem for so long, like we have a lot of communities that are just in total freefall. Like schools across California are closing. Like that's a very personal thing, like imagine your elementary school or your high school closing. Schools are closing, parks are being shuttered, community pools are being closed, in part because there's just no new housing being built, there's no new revenue being generated, but in part because there's just no demand, because there's just no children, there's no families anymore. I don't know, it can feel very apocalyptic, and you can look around and say, well, look, nothing changed here, right? No new housing units were built. But in every meaningful sense, these communities have changed dramatically. So I think people should be maybe more attuned to the downside risk of not building any new housing than I think the mostly theoretical and not really substantiated risks of building more.
Dawn, I have one for you. Do you have data or anecdote, I guess, about the benefits to the business community from building more housing?
So, oddly enough, I don't have statistics, but I do have stories. In 2020, a group of us came together and created the Housing Michigan Coalition. And because it's not, to Nolan's point, it's not just about housing. Like, our builders don't exist without people who want to live in homes, whatever that home looks like, right? Whether it's a multifamily, whether it's a duplex, whether it's a single-family home. Our members are not just running around the state building homes in the hopes that somebody will buy it, right? Because I don't know if any of you have tried to build a home lately, but it's not cheap to lay that capital outlay out, to get the funding that you need, to put down your bond, to do all the things you need to do, to even put a shovel in the ground. So the Grand Rapids Chamber, the Michigan Municipal League, despite the fact that people think we don't get along, most of the time we do, and Housing North, which is a nonprofit up in northern Michigan. We all came together and we looked at what Michigan was going to look like and what Michigan needed in terms of housing. And it was incentives for local units of government in terms of, I think Nolan mentioned, or maybe Representative Morgan, about giving and having grants available so that locals could upzone for housing and not have to have that out-of-pocket expense. We've supported that every time it's come up in the budget process. If we don't have the homes where people can live where they work, and I'm talking your teachers, your police, your fire, we are a big seasonal state, right? Like, we rely a lot on tourism. If you can't have, as a business, individuals able to move close to where they work so that they can work, live, and play all in the same area, it is detrimental. I mean, the Grand Rapids Chamber told a story where they had a member who offered a job to an employee, and that employee accepted and then couldn't find housing and they turned it down. So I don't think you can look at housing in a bubble and say it's all about housing. And I will say there's an election on Tuesday. I'm not going to promote one candidate, any candidate, or any party, but I will say this. We are going to have new leadership in January 1. We are going to have a new governor. We're going to have a new Senate Majority Leader. We may or may not have a new Speaker of the House. This issue is not going away, and I will leave you with 3 thoughts. We are an aging population, a declining population, and we need to have something in place to grow our economic growth. And at the end of the day, take housing out of it, but at the end of the day, you're going to need housing to support your schools and to support your communities and to support your businesses and your local units of government. Like, you can't look at us just as kind of in a bubble, because we are all connected whether we want to admit it or not.
So there's a question here about what are the goals and metrics that we would use to measure success. For YIMBY Plymouth, I would say building more housing units would be the main metric that we would see locally, but I'm curious if any of you have thoughts about other metrics we should be looking at or other steps that show progress.
The main metric that we care about is the median home price as a ratio of median household income. So take a typical home. What is that as a ratio of what a typical family is earning? 3 to 5 is generally a healthy ratio. Obviously, you want to be on the lower end. In California, statewide, we're at 9. LA is at like 18. If you want to see the results of that, again, open invitation. But really focusing on that. Is the typical home affordable to the typical family? A whole bunch of other things follow on from that. I think there's other indicators that matter. What percentage of renters are spending more than a third or half of their income on rent? Right, that's usually a pretty good metric of rental markets being out of whack. Rental vacancy rate, right? Until you get a rental vacancy rate above 10%, rents are not falling. You don't have a situation where landlords are competing for renters. You have a situation where renters are competing for an apartment. And then of course the last one we look at a lot is homelessness. Homelessness is of course extremely complicated, multifactorial, yada yada yada. But a big driver of it, the data suggests, is the availability and affordability of rental units. And so that's another indicator we look at, and that's another indicator that I think really spiraled out of control over the course of the pandemic, was huge rises in the number of people experiencing homelessness. And yeah, of course, it was many people with substance abuse problems or mental health issues, but it was also a lot of working low-income people who just had the rent go up on them, and they're suddenly sleeping out of their car or sleeping on the couch of a loved one. So those are 3 indicators that we really look at.
Thank you. So we have another one here about older people tend to vote more than younger people. What can we do to tailor our messaging or maybe show how this is important for people at every level of, every stage of life has a different type of housing need? How can we kind of tailor our message and get more of the voters on board with attainable housing? Rep Morgan, do you have some thoughts on that?
Sure. I do think one of the important pieces is to be compassionate in our messaging. Talk to folks, meet them where they're at, and have real conversations about why we're working on this issue, why we're talking about making some of these policy and legislative changes. I think you have a lot of situations where folks are genuinely scared that their entire community will change in a way that they don't feel welcome in anymore, that they don't feel like they fit in anymore. And I am a tireless advocate for building more housing, reforming the way that we're permitting and zoning things. But I also know that I moved to Southeast Michigan because I wanted to live in the community I wanted to live in. And it's because I loved the way it was. I also love the way it will be when it has the right amount and the right type of growth. But it's having those conversations and understanding that there are generational changes to the way that we look at the world. Somebody who grew up 30 years ago or 50 years ago lived in a whole different world than somebody who's my age in my 30s today, or somebody in their teens or their 20s. The challenges that we face are different. The experiences that we've had are different. The cost of things across the board are different. And having a compassionate conversation around bringing folks together generationally to talk about, hey, we understand that we love these great parts of our neighborhood, and let's have a conversation about how we can grow in a way that still feels like we're in the same community, but also allows more of us to live here. So maybe that single-family home is a duplex or a triplex now, but it's designed in a way that looks just similar to the fabric of our neighborhood already, where it adds value, not does something that feels like it's taking away. Those are hard conversations. They're particularly hard when we want to just say, let's do everything all at once immediately and just heck with whatever anybody thinks. That's just not a way that you can operate if you're going to bring folks along with you. And so that is the challenge I think we face sometimes, is having that conversation, that compassionate dialogue, and helping bring folks along with us. Listen, you're not going to get everybody. There are certainly some folks who are just going to say, I don't want anything to change ever. But the reality is, I think we can bring a lot of folks along who are just genuinely worried in between in a way that feels like a collaborative process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think something that's worth mentioning is also that AARP is supportive of at least ADU reform in a number of states, including in Michigan. So there is, advocacy for an older generation as well.
Yeah, I'll just reinforce that. I mean, of course, I think this issue often gets cast in generational terms, and certainly I think it's a problem that many young people don't have a path to homeownership, and they're dealing with rent burden. But to Jamie's point, one of our best friends in a lot of this advocacy has been AARP, right? There's a lot of low-income seniors who are renters who are in a precarious situation from a housing affordability perspective. There are a lot of seniors who are homeowners, and maybe their first priority is not seeing their home 10x in value, but maybe their first priority is, hey, I'd love, maybe to deed the kid to my son or daughter who's got a family, and I could build an ADU and I could live in the ADU and we can have an intergenerational home, right? Another one of these types of living and modes of living that was quite common historically that I think our zoning codes have served to stamp out. Many seniors want to downsize. They want to downsize without necessarily having to leave the state, but there just simply aren't the options. So, I think certainly there's a generational dynamic to this, but I think the housing affordability crisis affects people at all ages in different ways.
So we're coming up close to the end of the hour. I want to give you each a chance to either make a final remark or maybe share with some people in this room if they're interested in working on some of these reforms. What types of actions should they be taking? What can they do?
Well, I think this has been a great conversation. As I mentioned, housing is going to continue to be an issue. I don't know how many legislative days are left in this session. I've heard everything from, the budget was lame duck, and that was crazy in and of itself, to depending on what happens in November, could set the tone for November and December. Builders aren't the evil people that they sometimes get described as. I mean, how many of you live in a home? Thank a builder. How many of you remember, when you got your first home and that feeling, when you found your home, you knew it was it, right? That feeling of, this is where I'm meant to be. To Representative Morgan's point, communities are going to change. I mean, as populations get older, people, I hate to say it, but they are going to pass on and go someplace else, which means new people are going to come into your community. So the question is, can those new people come in and add value in terms of being able to attain that home in your community? Because it's a reality. The neighborhood I moved into, I think 13 years ago, had property around the corner from me that was not built. And I woke up one morning to the sounds of hammering, and I'm like, what is that noise? I now have, 10 to 15 new neighbors who have added value and diversity to our neighborhood. And we're doing a lot to build up our community within our space. And I think that's important. And, you talked about people who grew up 30 years ago. I was one of them, right? We didn't have this little invention, but what we did have was front porches where all the ages in our community would get together every night and sit on a porch and talk about how that community developed. My first starter home was mostly retirees, and they were great. They were 24-hour security. They knew everything that went on in that neighborhood, literally everything, when you came home and when you left. But it was great to have that sense of community. And, even working for builders, a lot of us now live in the backs of our homes, right? We don't live in the front anymore. We tend to live in the back. We don't really see our neighbors as much as we should or used to. But communities are going to survive if ADUs and townhomes and duplexes are added into the zoning. I mean, it's happening in other states, and we're not hearing a huge decline. And if Michigan is going to be a growth state, we need that type of housing available to either bring our kids back who left, bring our grandchildren back, or have a place for them to live and stay, because it's those people that are going to keep your community thriving.
Yeah, of course, after buying a few copies of my book, the most important thing you can do, get involved, right? This is, I think, part of what's shifted on this issue is that there's been a rise of real grassroots groups that are showing up at public hearings that historically had always been dominated by people who only ever said no, 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 and talked about how the sky was going to fall. And they showed up and said, hey, I live here, I'm from here, I'm invested in this community, and I think more housing and more neighbors would be a good thing for our community. I often will have somebody reach out to me and they'll say, oh, I really want to get involved in YIMBY advocacy, but there's no YIMBYs in my community. And I always tell them, you're the most important one. You're the first one, right? You going to a hearing that's otherwise dominated by people saying no, no, no to everything changes the discourse from neighbors oppose project to neighbors divided over project. And then in a very short time period, in my experience, you will get to neighbors support project, and you'll totally change the culture, and you'll create a path for other people to say, yeah, actually, I should get involved. So, at the state level, Abundant Housing Michigan's doing excellent work. I'd say get on their listserv. When they ask you to call or email and harass your state legislators, with all due respect, do that, right? That matters. You can be sure that they're getting phone calls and emails from people who don't want anything to change and don't want a single new housing unit to ever be built. And so we got to call and drive that traffic and remind people, hey, there are a lot of people that care about this. Show up at the public hearings and like I said, be positive, right? I think something, I'm very active now in Sacramento, and I think something that really helps us is that I think we try to be positive and friendly and talk to opponents, and we don't necessarily dismiss their concerns. And to the extent we can improve projects with small amendments, I think that's something that we're open to. And I think that creates a permission structure for local elected officials and local planners to sort of take a similar posture. Get involved if you're local. Plymouth YIMBY is doing great work and very generously hosted us today. It's small-scale movement building, a sort of thing that a lot of Americans just don't do anymore, right? We're so siloed. All of our politics are online, and that's great. You should tweet about how much you love every single bill, yada, 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 but getting out there, showing up, and being involved in a real movement is key.
I would just go back to this central point in that what we're talking about and what we're looking to do is not just about zoning or even one piece of the giant puzzle of addressing affordability. It is about ensuring that we have an American dream again for young people and young families where they can actually build a great life in great communities and in our great state of Michigan. That is what we're trying to get at here. And we just have to remind ourselves of our values and why we care about this. Again, it isn't about one little piece. It's about a giant puzzle that we're putting together here to be able to allow people to build a great life. So zoning is a big piece of it, addressing the bad actors in our system around private equity, buying up housing in some cases, a very small amount in Michigan, but in some cases it's about ensuring real protections for renters and for homeowners in the process. It's about bringing down the cost of building as much as we can, speeding up the timeline and streamlining where we can to where you're going to allow the same thing at the end of the day, but we could do it twice as fast to just simply reduce the cost of that piece of it. It's about so many parts of this that we have to work on, and it's about the conversations that we have in our neighborhoods, in our communities across the state around doing it in a way that brings everyone to the table and make sure everybody has a piece of what we need to grow and develop our communities. It's looking at that bigger picture of how it all works together. Infrastructure, water and sewer, roads, transportation, public transit, neighborhood building, parks, schools. We have some school board folks and candidates and things here with Lisa McIntyre on the school board. The schools are a critical part of all of this. Look at the most expensive places to live. They are the places that people want to live in. Why are the costs going up here in Plymouth? Because it's a really amazing place to live, and everyone knows that. We need to accept that and embrace that aspect of it and make sure that we can allow more folks to live and grow in the same way that so many of our families have over the years. I think that's what we're here for. We've got to get some good things done and move forward together. And the last thing I'll just say is really ask us tough questions as elected officials. Ask us where we stand on issues and make sure that you don't make any assumptions about where folks are. Regardless of party affiliation or where we represent or otherwise. But genuinely ask, where do you stand in some of these issues that you care about? And push us. Push us to have the courage to push things forward. Sometimes being a little more progressive on some of these things is not always easy. And it's not always simple either. So push us and ask us and work with folks as you're looking at who you're going to be supporting for various things. Thank you.
So if you enjoyed this discussion today and want to continue the conversation, our next YIMBY Plymouth meeting will be August 29th. Get on our email list and we'll send out the details for those as they're finalized. But really, we hope all of you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you so much for coming today, and please join me in thanking all of our excellent panelists.